Great to see everyone. Those of you who remembered to set your clocks. The rest of them are snoozing away. Our theme this year is love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. So what I want to do is not just preach a series. And so I want to be crystal clear about that this is about connecting with God, connecting the message, and actually going out and doing these things. Because if at the end of the day we sit here and we listen and we nod and we say, yep, that's great, that's wonderful, that's motivating, but we do nothing with it, we're not living out our faith. And so I hope that these messages encourage you to go out and to be doing these things. Today we're going to be talking about Tabitha. And she was a woman, she was a disciple in the city of Joppa. And so before we get into the text and really get deep into the text, I'm going to talk a little bit about Joppa, because you might be thinking, okay, Joppa, what's the significance of Joppa? Well, Joppa is a city that's thousands of years old. And so you might think of Joppa, and you might be familiar with it, because that was the city where Solomon, when he built the temple, had the logs brought in, shipped in to Joppa, and brought down to Jerusalem. Joppa was a port city. It's right north of Jerusalem, and it's on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. You might also be familiar with Joppa because there was a very famous prophet, my son Cameron's favorite prophet, named Jonah. Jonah hopped on a ship at Joppa. When he was running from God, Jonah went to Joppa, and he hopped on a ship, and he wanted to get as far away from God as he possibly could. He was trying to get to a place called Tarshish, and of course, out on the sea, he encountered this storm and was thrown into the ocean. He boarded that ship in Joppa. Joppa was also a city where Peter came, and Peter saw a vision of this sheep being let down by its four corners with all these unclean animals on it, right? How did Peter get to Joppa? Well, enter this story. Prior to this, how did the church wind up in Joppa? How were their disciples in Joppa? Well, there was a certain man by the name of Philip. You remember the Ethiopian eunuch? We all know that story from Acts chapter 8. There's this eunuch who's in his chariot, and Philip, the evangelist, is told by the Spirit, you need to run down and find this person who's in this chariot. So Philip runs, and he meets this eunuch, and he has this Bible study with him. And so they're riding along, and finally the eunuch says, well, here's a body of water. What hinders me from being baptized? It's one of my favorite conversion stories in the New Testament, because it strips away all the normal things that we usually find with a conversion story, and it's just a really unique story. And there's this sense of urgency where the guy's like, I want to be baptized right now. So my question today is, as we talk about this and we talk about loving your neighbor, is how much influence do you think you have on the world when you just put your head down and serve other people? See, a lot of us think, well, you know, I have to do this big thing, and I have to be connected to the right people, and I have to be with a trustworthy church, and a church that has a good reputation, and I have to, and we become obsessed with growing our church and with making a name as a Christian, and we feel like if we're not doing that, then we're not having this big global impact. To which I come back and I say that's complete nonsense. I've been really in tune with these individuals in Scripture. Some of them have names, some of them don't have names, and they have this global impact just by being faithful. There are no bells and whistles, no accolades, no glamour, no big vibrant churches. It's just people serving other people. And Tabitha was one of those people. See, Tabitha was a disciple, and she just served. She served widows. That's all she did. As far as we know, that's what she did. She made tunics and garments for these widows. They were poor widows. They didn't have clothing. She would make clothing for them, and she would give them to them. It was a pretty thankless job, to be honest. Just made clothing. She sat and she made clothing. She knitted day after day, gave clothing to the widows, and went back, make more clothes, would give them to the widows, would go back, make more clothes. I doubt that a whole lot of people from the community even knew who Tabitha was. I doubt that many people from even in their local congregation in Joppa gave her much acknowledgement. I don't think she was asking for acknowledgement. I don't think she wanted a place on the stand at the church and, she wanted recognition. I don't think she cared about that. I think in her mind, she was just making clothes for widows because they needed them. And so I asked, how did the church get here? And I mentioned Philip. See, Philip was in this region, and after he baptized the eunuch, he started planting churches in this region. He's just preaching. He went from town to town, and he would just preach the word. I think after Philip preached in Joppa, there was probably a pretty, what we would consider an insignificant church. I'd be shocked if the church in Joppa was any more than 30, 40, 50 people maybe. But within that church was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas, which translated again means gazelle. See, there was this woman, this disciple, who just day after day made clothing for widows because she just wanted to serve them. Luke records she was full of good works and acts of charity. She was also giving her money. She would make clothing and she would give money. Make clothing and give money. Make clothing and give money. Beyond this, we don't know anything else about Tabitha. Verse 37, in those days she became ill and died. And when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, that is in Lydda, sent 2 men to him, urging him, please come to us without delay. Okay, so now I want you to picture this. Lydda is 9 miles away, so that's basically from here to Shanksville. There are 2 men who see these grieving widows, and I presume that these men are from the church. They're from the local congregation in Joppa. All of a sudden, one of their own, this disciple named Dorcas or Tabitha, she dies. They send for Peter, who's 9 miles away. My question is why? See, I assume that they just didn't know what to do. It's a new church. When there's a death in the congregation, it's tough. And now you have these widows who are dependent on this woman for clothing, and she's gone. So that creates not just problems with grief and how do we manage grief and what do we do with that, but they now had a problem. How do we provide clothing for these widows? All of a sudden their clothing supply is cut off, their money supply is cut off. What do we do? Ask Peter. Peter's in the region. We need to send people right now, and he needs to get back here immediately because we don't know what to do. Verse 39, so Peter rose and he went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. And the widows stood beside him weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. I love this scene because the widows they're not just grieving. They're not just saying, well, we lost a friend. We lost a sister in Christ. They're showing him. They're saying, look what she did for us. Do you understand? Do you know what this means? Do you know what she did for us? Do you know that when we were naked and we were poor and we were starving, this woman cared for us. This woman met our needs. She loved us. Look at the clothes she made for us. And they're weeping. And I love what unfolded, because I don't think Peter had any intention when he was 9 miles away and these men showed up and said, Peter, you got to come and help us figure this thing out. I don't think that Peter was thinking, I'm going to raise this woman from the dead. I don't think that was even on his radar. I think Peter was moved by compassion. I think Peter saw that this woman was so loved and so needed that that's what drove Peter to do what happened next. But Peter put them all outside, and he knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. You remember last week I preached on that scene with Jesus and Peter. Jesus is predicting to Peter that he's going to betray him, and he says, Peter, Satan has demanded your soul. He's demanded to have you. But I'm praying that your faith will not fail. And when you have turned back, in other words, after you've betrayed me, after you've denied me, and you've turned back, turn and strengthen your brothers. And I said we see a completely different Peter. There's a radical shift in Peter after Jesus raises from the dead. Peter now is bold. Peter is on point. Peter is compassionate. Peter's on fire. Peter's full of the Spirit. Peter is on mission. I mean, Peter is just nailing it time and time and time and time again. And I think this is another one of those moments. Peter knows what to do in that moment. This is the first person who's raised by one of the disciples post Jesus' ascension. Jesus is raised up from the dead. He goes up into heaven, and this is the first time that one of Jesus' disciples raises someone from the dead in this moment in Joppa. And he says, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes. And I love this because it's another one of those one-liners in Luke. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. Do you understand the power of this verse? See, she knew who Peter was before she died. I don't think she had ever met Peter. I think for her to meet one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ would have been the highlight of her life. To say, man, I met one of these guys who's going out and is changing the world. And she gets sick, and she's never had recognition that we know of. She just served day after day after thankless day. She's making clothes for her widows because that's just the right thing to do. She gets sick, and she dies. Never having known that she would make a global impact, and that 2,000 years later she would be recorded in the book of life, and people are preaching Tabitha all over the globe. She woke up, opened her eyes after having died. There's Peter. Now, can you imagine what's going through her mind in that moment? I've reached the pearly gates, and it's true what they say. Peter's there at the gates to greet you. She opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. What a surreal moment. And he gave her his hand. I love the compassion clothed in this verse. He gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and the widows, he presented her alive. Listen to this. Listen to this impact. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. You see, Peter found Tabitha worthy. See, Tabitha, who just worked, and oftentimes my wife and I have this conversation with each other, and we're like, okay, are we making any impact at all? Do you ever feel that way? Are we making any impact at all? We're not seeing results. We're just geared that way to see results. We want to see results. We want to know that we're having an impact. That's why some of us, even though we hate cleaning things, we like cleaning, because you can see progress. You see the messy room, and then after you see the finished product, and we're like, yes, I accomplished something today. We're wired that way. And Tabitha may have been wired that way too. We don't know. But we know one thing, that she was consistent, and she just gave of her talents and her money and her time. And she just did it. She didn't complain that we know of. She just did it. She never imagined that she would make such an impact that Peter would be standing in front of and have an audience with the widows who she made the clothing for. She never imagined that they would be showing the garments that Peter made for them. She never imagined that Peter would raise her from the dead. She never imagined that Peter would be so moved by this that many people believed in the Lord because he raised her from the dead. She never imagined that Peter, the next verse, stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon a tanner. You see, Peter wasn't supposed to be in Joppa. It wasn't on the itinerary. It wasn't part of the plan. And while he was in Joppa, staying with Simon the tanner, Peter went up on a roof to pray. He fell into a trance, and he had this vision of this sheet being let down with all these unclean animals, and he heard a voice say, "Peter, get up and eat." Oh, but Lord, I've never let anything unclean touch my lips. You remember that vision? It was in Joppa. What brought Peter to Joppa? Tabitha. What brought Tabitha to Christ? Philip. Philip and one Ethiopian eunuch started a chain of events that just unfolded and unfolded, and God blessed and God blessed and God blessed, and it was just people doing what they were called to do. We may die not knowing how big of an impact we make, but here's my plea to you today. Here's my plea to you. Do what's right. Stay on mission. Don't worry about numbers. Don't worry about progress. Don't worry about, well, is God really using me? Don't worry about that. The answer is yes. If you trust in God, then yes, God's using you. My question is, are you every single day serving other people in the name of Jesus Christ? If the answer to that is yes, then the answer to your other question, is God using this? Is God blessing me? Am I making an impact? The answer is yes, yes, yes. 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 But the bigger point is this. If we're not serving by loving our neighbor, the answer is no, no, no. And in fact, Jesus is so strong that he says, there are some people that I'm going to say, get away from me. I never knew you. See, our point isn't to get focused on progress and how big we can grow a church and how, we focus on all the wrong things. The right thing to focus on is serving your neighbor, getting your sleeves rolled up, getting your hands dirty, getting in there and just doing it because we're called to do it. Find someone who's in need. James is right. Pure and undefiled religion is this: to take care of the orphans and the widows and to keep yourself unstained from the world. Find people who are orphans and widows. We're in conversation right now. We've talked a lot about vision. I just had a conversation this past week. We're talking with different organizations in town. I'm working with victim services, and I am asking and pleading with them, you guys have access to all these people who are just struggling. They're just in a bad place. Help us help them. And they're more than willing. And they're excited. And we're going to be serving people in this community together. I am pumped about that. I'm excited about that. It's not going to be glamorous. Listen to me. Pay attention now. It's not going to be glamorous. It's not going to be glamorous. It's going to be hard. It's going to feel thankless. But look at Tabitha. We're going to bless people. You don't have to wait for me. You don't have to wait for my lead. Find people in your community today and bless them. Do one kind thing for them every single day. God will bless it. I promise you that. If there's anybody this morning who has any prayer needs or anybody who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, we invite you to come up. You can come up front, or our shepherds will be in the back. You can go back and talk with them as we stand and sing together. Be blessed.